Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and my wormery basically consists of this shelf over here with these tubs. All the tubs have worms in them. Different types of worms, different size populations, some small, some big. Today the bin that I wanted to check in on is my smallest population, and that's by a long shot. It's at most a couple dozen worms, or at least that's what I think that I started out with. And when I first came down here, I thought to myself, oh darn, which one of them is it? And then I remembered it has a very distinct visual appearance because we had sort of partitioned off the contents of the container to have a section covered in plastic, the side here with the bubble wrap, and a side not covered in plastic, creating a much more damp space beneath the plastic since evaporation is prevented there. And ideally, you know, converse to that, we've got a dry section over there with which probably the worms for the most part have been avoiding, creating a little bit more of a dense population on the damp side so that those few worms do have opportunities to bump into each other and, you know, perhaps even mate and reproduce a little bit. So we're going to get this system up here on the bench. I'll slip on a glove and then we could get to work, see how things are progressing in here. I'm getting myself geared up to be away for a couple of days, sort of making next weekend into an extended long weekend. And before going away, I intend to check in on all my systems, make sure they all got what they need. Even though worm bins in general don't need a lot of hands-on attention, they pretty much get by just fine. Even when they're completely mismanaged, they seem to do a-okay. Not always, but a lot of people you hear saying that, how they more or less neglected their systems for a long, long time, and then, hey, you come back, worms are just fine. Not always the case, so you don't want to just make that a habit, being a neglectful worm farmer. But luckily, worms are very resilient and adaptable. And I think what we're seeing here in this system is definitely an adaptable population of worms. They're really the last few examples of the original population that I started out with a few years ago that was originally given to me as my first worm bin. And I had a little bit of a worm bin mismanagement problem myself not long ago, resulting in the loss of all my systems that had red wiggler worms in them. And those were the types of worms that I had started out with, so I'd lost all the worms that I could really track back to my very first worm bin, which I thought was really a regrettable situation. But when I went picking through some of the material that those poor worms had inhabited before I had the big die-offs, I did find baby worms that had somehow, I guess, weathered the conditions that had done in their previous generation, but things had evidently subsided to a more tame kind of environment in time for the cocoons that were left behind to hatch. So just a quick switch of gears here in topic. This stuff was outside for quite some time, so it's not surprising that certain, creatures could have occupied the material that our worms live in. And this is some sort of creature that has made itself pretty comfortable in a lot of my systems. I keep finding these. I continuously keep fishing them out. Sometimes I wish I had fish or something, reptiles, that I could feed those suckers to. But since I don't know what they are, and I don't want to find out either, I'm just pulling them out. So I think we hinted at last week potentially expanding the domain for this population of worms out into this section that's been intentionally left dry. Not to say that castings get very dry, because you can see I go underneath the dry surface an inch and I'm already in material that's got a nice moisture level to it. But since worms like to wander, I'm sure any worm that might have been perfectly comfortable in this stuff eventually just wanders into this stuff, finds this stuff to be that much more damp, I think they can tell, so they're just going to gravitate back towards what seems to be more up their alley versus wandering aimlessly into stuff that's not quite as comfortable to be in. So I don't see any worms out here. It's pretty much what we were after. And hopefully the encouragement of keeping the worms in a somewhat more isolated, more confined space is going to result in a little bit of worm breeding, a little bit of action. I've been deliberately avoiding the disturbing of this surface here on the top of the section where the moisture had been recirculating under the plastic. I thought that if I stalled, I could maybe, while I'm talking, just continue to sort of gaze down into this section of the bin to see if I could spot any cocoons. Last time we did actually spot a cocoon, which really meant a lot to me, because that suggests that, hey, these worms are actually now meeting each other. There's enough of an occurrence of worm encounters with one another that they're actually starting to mate, and that, you know, the presence of cocoons is a indicator of that. And then we even saw the other promising thing we noticed last time we were in here was the little baby worms too that we started spotting in here, which was something we'd normally not seen a whole lot of in the past here in this system. A lot of times we'd have to dig and dig and dig before we would encounter any worms, but I mean, right when I started peeling stuff back, I started spotting worms near the surface right away. That was really a good sign, positive sign, better than what I'd seen in the past, that we've seen in the past. We've seen all this stuff together. Very little happens down here in my bins that's not included in a video on my channel. But yeah, you could see, I guess being near a piece of banana peel is not surprising. That's probably where you're going to find lots of worms usually. But I mean, we've already just incidentally bumped into, you know, half a dozen worms just from probing around here, not even trying too hard to come up with worms. And a lot of them do seem to be pretty small in size, suggesting that even though we're not having a lot of luck finding cocoons, there must be cocoons in here. They must be hatching, and that's where these babies must be coming from. Or at least that's what my optimistic side of my brain wants to say. We're finding little slimy bits of things in here, and those are the banana peel. It was only a week that we came in here last time, but like I said earlier, I'm sort of preparing to be away for a few days, so I probably wouldn't have come back into this bin after only 7 days. But I wanted to just sort of put it on my list of bins that I've checked, and I've made sure that they've got everything that they need while I'm away, and I don't have to sweat it for these little guys. But I had sort of treated this system as one of the systems that needs the least amount of interaction from me just because of the small number of worms in here. However, last time we sort of, I don't know, somehow acknowledged the fact that this worm bin seemed to have somehow gotten back onto its feet and was really showing signs of being in great shape, you know. Just in terms of seeing cocoons, in terms of seeing baby worms. Another indicator was seeing how a banana peel that had been placed in there in the previous feeding had for the most part vanished. We thought we'd find leftovers since we thought we had very few worms in here to feed. But just the way that last feeding, the feeding prior to last feeding, had vanished, we decided to double it up. So the feeding it got 7 days ago was actually 2 banana peels. Plus I think some coffee even. So we did feed twice as much last time, and we're checking in less time. So it's not surprising that we're finding leftovers. But not quite as much as I thought we would see. For some reason, after 7 days, I expected to see very large chunks of banana peel, but you could see only little fragments here and there, which is kind of awesome. It's going to roll off my fingers, so you could see it on the tip of my index finger is a pretty light colored, almost like greenish color worm cocoon. That's what they look like when they're pretty newly deposited. As they get older and older, closer to the point in time when they're going to actually hatch, they get darker and darker in color. So it's ones that are pretty new, like that one, that are the easiest ones to spot usually amongst all this dark material. When you got a really fresh bin that's got a lot of light colored stuff in it still, not a lot of castings yet basically, it's really tough to spot those things. But this system definitely has a lot of nice dark material. It's pretty damp, so it too gets some of its darkness, I guess, just from the fact that it is damp and kept nice and damp with the plastic. Makes it a little bit easier to spot the cocoons, but I gotta admit, while I was sort of plowing through here, I was looking just more from the point of view of, hey, how many worms are we going to encounter? I wasn't really looking for cocoons. Maybe if I can sort of train my brain to multitask while I'm plowing through this stuff, I'd have more luck spotting more things. This little guy is real springy, jumping around. So we're going to let him back into the system. Pretty good sized worm compared to all the other ones. All the other ones seem like they're little suckers, little babies. So I would think when we find a good sized worm like those got to be some of the ones that we probably included in some of our worm counts when we'd actually gone in here in previous check-ins and counted every single worm that we encountered. At this point, I think we finally graduated from that in this system, because we just keep seeing little itsy bitsy worms everywhere. And I'm thinking just those few pieces of banana peel that we found, and we sort of threw them into this middle area. I don't know. If you ask me, that's not a lot of food left over, suggesting that this bin definitely has a pretty good size appetite, and we should not ignore that. I didn't really know what to expect, and I was sort of hoping that it would go this way, like what we're seeing here. Sort of confirmation that this bin has got a good size appetite, much greater than we had anticipated in the past. And when you slow down, that's when you start to really see them. All these little itsy bitsy worms everywhere, all over the place. So I've got a feeling, even though we had estimated we've only got a couple dozen worms in here, I think we've actually, with a little patience, gotten to the point where we're probably beyond that at this point, which is really what I was hoping for, and something I'm really glad to see. And I think because of that, we're going to probably now follow through with what my idea was last time, and some of you might already be tuned into what that is, and that's going to be expanding the domain of these little wormies to also include the other end of the bin, which is this dry side, I guess, what it's been until now. But we're going to just get rid of that whole thing of there being a small constrained space on one side of the bin. We're going to go back to using the whole space, and we're going to, I guess, define this as the middle. I'm not going to force anything with the stuff that's a little bit drier over here, but by extending the plastic coverings to go over there, in addition to what's already been benefiting from having plastic coverings, gradually the moisture in the bin will make its way into that stuff over there. And I'm wondering if maybe we would even give it a little jump start by maybe grabbing a good portion of it and just placing it right where we know we're going to be putting the food that they're going to get today. And up until now, it's just been a little tiny piece of fruit given to them as their feedings. I'm wondering what I've got in the freezer that I could give them that might be a little change of pace. I'll have to shoot upstairs, go check what's in my refrigerator that we could use to feed these little guys with. And once I get back, we'll apply today's feeding, get this system fed, and then I'll know that it's in good shape to be without my attention for a little while I'm away for the long weekend next weekend. So let's pause now, and I'll return with a little bit of food for these guys. So the other day I was preparing some breaded meat, some kind of like Wiener Schnitzel style food, and along with the fried meat I was going to make some fried mushrooms too. And the other package, luckily there were two, the other package, the mushrooms smelled fine. This package, this mushrooms did not smell fine. If you ever smelled what rotting mushrooms smell like, you'll know. It's pretty gross, and that's what it smelled like. So I did not make food out of that stuff. I put it immediately aside so that it could turn into worm food. Now, with those foods that we're going to give them, that coffee, the coffee filter, the mushrooms, we're sort of restoring normalcy to this bin. We'd always been sort of very careful, just, one little piece of food. We don't need to add bedding. We don't need to do this. We don't need to do that. You know what? My systems, when they get fed, they get bedding, they get grit. If they need moisture, they get moisture, whatever the case may be. This is going to be the return of this bin to normal management, normal type of a feeding, perhaps even one that might be considered a little bit large, considering the somewhat small population in here, but that's deliberate. I'd really like for me to be able to defer the next check-in on this to a period of time down the road a little bit. And that's kind of how we're going to treat it now, and at the end we're going to cover it up entirely with plastic again. So even though I've got a really nifty collection of sort of pre-made bedding, it's been sort of marinating in its own juices for a number of weeks now, I've also got some of this stuff. This piece of newspaper was part of the top covering, but it was sort of dangling there. I wanted to get rid of that. We've got the piece of paper, the coffee filter, nice piece of bedding to include, piece of soiled napkin. So we're going to layer in today's feeding. A little bit of bedding, a little bit of food, a little bit of bedding, a little bit of food. There's also the grit that you can add once in a while to your feedings. In my case, the grit's pulverized eggshell. And I want to make quick work of this since this stuff is pretty stinky. I did have it in the freezer though, so it probably won't emit as much odor as it did when I first encountered it, when I first uncovered it. So I don't think I have too much to worry about. There's even a little bit of ice crystals developing on here too. So let's save a couple. Well, you know what? Forget this whole layering thing. We might as well just treat any future layers as stuff that's going to cover this stinky food and make sure it's submerged down enough so that none of the odor of this stuff comes out. And hopefully it just gets consumed quickly before I have to come back in here and smell it again. It's the type of food that I think actually will go pretty quickly, mushrooms. If my memory serves me correctly, they're usually a hit when it comes to the worm bin. So the worms, I think, will probably make a pretty quick meal out of it. Okay. Coverage for the stinky food, just in case. Well, whatever. I think there's going to be plenty of time between now and the next check-in for the worms to get rid of it. Oh, I'm already starting to smell it a little bit. Pretty gross. All right, let's not waste any more time. Let's get this thing covered up. Make sure we've got good coverage over the stinky mushrooms. We don't want to make a mountain out of this either, so we're going to try to level things off a little bit here. I just wanted to make sure that that food was pretty adequately submerged. I guess mixing things up a little bit like we just did here, that'll also probably help with getting the moisture shared into some of the drier stuff that's in here. And like I said, the plastic covering, that's going to probably contribute a lot too. Oops, you know what? We almost missed the last little portion here. So before we write this off as a done deal, let's get the last of the coffee out of here. And you know what? The nice thing about having this coffee filter here is that we have yet another element to contribute to the bin being more back on the normal list and not to be treated as being any different or less than any other bin. We're indicating where we last fed with our traditional feeding zone indicator being the coffee filter spread out over where we last fed. But it's also now serving the secondary function of being a little bit of extra protection in terms of odor barrier, just in case it starts to get stinky down in there. Hopefully that won't be the case. So how else can we utilize the rest of this stuff over here? We're going to be covering with plastic. So just like this newspaper piece over here being pretty damp, this dry piece is going to get pretty damp too pretty soon. So they're not going to be distinguishable from each other, I believe, if we sort of set them up in an equal fashion. So we'll put the stuff that was already damp over on this side, and we'll just spread the one that's been pretty dry lately over on this side. Now we got some pretty decent coverage down here in our bin. I never know what to name it because we kind of come up with a new name for this bin almost every week. I think Bounce Back was my last idea for what to call it. But today I just don't have anything on the tip of my tongue. Maybe when I name the video I'll come up with something catchy. So we'll see. Alright everyone, that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Bye now.